Shalom, this is Mary Omni. This is a Republic Notice. The title of this Republic Notice is called, Why Constitutionally the Zimmerman Verdict Has No Legal Justification. Why constitutionally the Zimmerman verdict has no legal justification. It's 2013, and the U.S. corporate entity of 1871 is the basic contractors of Zimmerman, most of the judges, prosecuting attorney, most of the jurors, and all immigrants who came to America after 1871. See, the Constitution was sealed off by 1870 through non-consent jurisdiction. Now, one has to consent to be governed, okay? Now, to take this a step further, all those who came after 1871 came for the American dream, and they came here voluntarily, which means they came here by consent, and that's by consent to be governed. But prior to 1871, from 1787 to 1870, you had a group of people called Black Americans who was written as 3/5, which some say is a clause, but you have to remember 3 + 8 = infinity, so the Most High hand is in this. The Most High hand is wherever his people go. 3/5 also mean from the third to the fifth dimension, okay? It doesn't only mean that a vote was necessary to abolish slavery as a 3/5 clause. Whatever it means, this 3/5 could not consent, and that's what you need to understand. This 3/5 was considered Black Americans who was framed in the Constitution according to the 1857 Judge Taney decision. They could not consent. They had no legal rights, because they said Dred Scott had no legal rights to consent, but he was framed in the Constitution. Well, framed in the Constitution means four corners of the law of the Constitution. Now, that meant when he inherited the 14th Amendment, when he inherited the abolishment of slavery, and then he inherited the 1866 national persons, he became a nation, part of a nation in 1866, with contractual automated enforcement rights of non-consent legality jurisdiction in all states and territories, called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Mind you, this was 5 years prior to the U.S. corporation. So they had contractual enforcement rights of non-consent jurisdiction in all states and territories 5 years prior to the 1871 U.S. corporation, which means they had legality of non-consent contractual enforcement before the U.S. corporation of 1871, which came 5 years later after the 13, 14, 15 Amendment. The 15th Amendment came in 1870. And it sealed the Constitution with the New Jerusalem Wall, a supreme vote of non-consent. See, Dred Scott gained a supreme vote of non-consent, automated, just like his Civil Rights Act of contractual enforcement, non-consent jurisdiction in all states and all territories. This showed that our Revolutionary and Civil War soldiers was not playing with their blood. See, race was secondary. The protection of the cosmic blood spill was first. So they supreme blacks in the Constitution because as non-consenters, they was God's sovereign. As a matter of fact, they took it with 300 years to be God's sovereign. Most people see that as them being weak because that's the way their minds are trained. But you have to be extremely strong to take a whip 300 years to remain God's sovereign and a non-consenter. For if blacks wasn't considered, they wouldn't need a chains and whips. Now, they achieved a great thing in that they was constitutionalized legally as non-consenters. And so they achieved, the constitutional writers and reconstructionists beautifully achieved non-consent God's sovereignty in the Constitution of the United States supreme contractual God sovereignty, and the Union won the war, so they God sovereign all the land to blacks, and told the Indian chiefs of the Seminole, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Cherokee, and the Creek to do the same thing. The 1866 treaties can be found. Now, I'm giving you this history background to tell you that Zimmerman came to America voluntarily and had an accident with a non-consenter, which means Trayvon Martin, Tracy Martin, and Sabrina Martin had non-consent supremacy for Zimmerman to be here. Now, the Banksters and the Catholic invited a lot of people here to trample the constitutional republic, see, because they want to build the kingdom of Satan on God's sovereignty, okay? They want to trample God's sovereignty, and so they get all those who are willing to dream on top of blood, theft, death, and massacres and slavery to come and say they have legal rights higher than the God sovereign constitutional writers, reconstructionists, civil rights soldiers, revolutionaries, captives, and natives. So letting George Zimmerman off, they said he had more rights than all the constitutional signers, all the constitutional reconstructions, all the soldiers of the Revolutionary, the Civil War, all those that fought in the Mexican-American War, all the captives, and all the native nations. That's what they said by letting him off. Because Trayvon Martin represents all them people blood. Trayvon Martin is the God sovereignty heir of non-consent jurisdiction. He didn't consent for George Zimmerman's parents to be here. So therefore, any tragedy that happens on this soil, Trayvon Martin automatically has the supreme contract of non-consent for George Zimmerman to be here in the first place. So George Zimmerman, according to the constitutional republic, and Trayvon Martin and his parents, George Zimmerman is an 1871 mule contractor, U.S. squatter, that needed to be netted and was netted by the mule to identify squatting immigrants and immigrants born from squatting immigrants, like George Zimmerman. So, you know, the mule actually is also owned by Trayvon Martin and his people. Because like I said, in 1866, they had national enforcement non-consent rights under the Civil Rights Act 5 years prior to the U.S. corporation. The U.S. corporation is that mule that they had prior non-consent jurisdiction on in the 1866 Civil Rights and the 1868 inheritance of their 14th Amendment and 1870 inheritance of their 15th New Jerusalem Wall non-consent supreme vote. Non-consent wall, non-consent contractual supremacy. So anything occurs with a constitutional citizen by someone who came after 1871 is an illegal squatter on his land, trampling his constitutionality, causing the accident. Because Trayvon didn't go nowhere where George Zimmerman had constitutional supremacy, inherited constitutional God sovereignty. Trayvon Martin didn't go to him. He and his mother bought Zimmerman on his land to steal Trayvon Martin birthrights. So he came and he wanted to trample Trayvon Martin constitutionality for his birthrights. Trayvon Martin has the God sovereign contract with Sabrina Martin with the land. Because like it or not, the Union won the war. And the Union made sure succession couldn't occur. They married the land to constitutional citizens who had non-consent jurisdiction supremacy, equal to the supremacy clause. Therefore, one can trample the land just like a pack of dogs, but the contract will never change. The land is non-consent and supreme contractual. See, this is why you'll use Black's mule now. They're U.S. corporate mule. So you're saying, as a mule contractor, George Zimmerman had the right to defend himself while he's contracting with Trayvon Martin mule on Trayvon Martin land, on Trayvon Martin birthrights, on Trayvon Martin wealth, on Trayvon Martin land where all the buildings' assets are, and that somehow Trayvon Martin came into his territory where he got the God sovereignty on, even though it could be proven Trayvon Martin is a constitutional republic citizen, and it could be proven that George Zimmerman and his mother and father came years later after the Republic was formed and after the war had been fought, called the Civil War. So he's coming in and established land, birthright, and territory, so any accidents occur is automatically the fault of those who have no constitutionality to be there in the first place. Let me repeat this concept. Any accident or tragedy occurs involving a constitutional citizen is automatically the fault of those who are non-consented to be in this country in the first place by supreme constitutional non-consent jurisdiction republic contract, which Trayvon Martin and his parents are in, called the Constitutional Republic, 1 through 15 Supreme Contract. Now, you can get into semantics and argue about who was in America first and start pulling up archives and all this stuff, but in truth, George Zimmerman and his parents consent to be governed and consent that they don't have any birthrights or land rights in this country when they contract with the U.S. corporate MULE. And since they're not of the non-consent jurisdiction like blacks, they have no protections from consent to debt, theft, and consent that they have no constitutional rights or protections in this country. So you can dig up the archives all you want to, even though Constitutional Republic blacks are in all major landholding Native Nations treaties. They are the actual Dawes contract walking, and I can prove everything I am saying. Therefore, George Zimmerman and his parents consent to Trayvon Martin, U.S. corporate MULE that he inherited. Because God's namesake inherited, they don't consent. They was born here by force and chains and was forced to work by whips to take the whip of Satan so that they would be the God sovereign supreme contractual non-consenters, blood purity for the kingdom come of the King David kingdom. They are the redemption contractors. Therefore, they had to be God sovereign because they're the namesake. They're the namesake of God Almighty. They have King Yeshua as their king of the Judaic nation. So therefore, it is no technicality you can pull out of the Bar Association who contract with Trayvon Martin, MULE, ANUS, and consent as the whole Bar Association legal system to debt, theft, and consent of no constitutionality. This is why you need a Stand Your Ground Act. But all acts done on the soil is governed by non-consent jurisdiction again. So Trayvon Martin owns the land and owns the Stand Your Ground Act by supreme contract, as his father is the New Jerusalem Wall of automated non-consent jurisdiction vote supremacy. So therefore, Public Mystery Babylon declared its whole guilt as public Florida residents, its whole guilt in the murder, the trampling, the consent to debt and theft, and the demise by genocide of Trayvon Martin for the stealing of his birthrights by coming into land you are not consented in by supreme contract. Okay? And you consent to the MULE. George Zimmerman consented to his guilt. When he murdered Trayvon, he consented that he had no business being in this country. He consented that because he's born from parents who consent that. The constitutional citizen republic have non-consent to their citizenship because it's been non-consented since 1868. They couldn't consent for it. They inherited. Therefore, there is no technicality whatsoever that you can pull anywhere, even out of Trayvon MULE, that makes George Zimmerman innocent. And I suggest that you rearrest this man and recharge him with murder based on constitutionality instead of incorporate doctrine dumb contracts that don't have no supremacy on their soil. Because it is subservient to the Constitution, and the Constitution owns both. Because to have corporate rights, you gotta have constitutional rights. George Zimmerman don't have incorporate doctrine rights because he don't have constitutional rights. Trayvon Martin parents have constitutional rights and they own a U.S. corporate MULE by supreme contract. Therefore, rearrest this man, charge him with murder, because that whole judge, the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorney, the jurors would be charged with manslaughter. They would be charged with conspiracy to commit manslaughter If this man is not rearrested by that Attorney General, she will be charged with manslaughter, a constitutional supreme authority. The governor will be charged with manslaughter by constitutional supreme covenant authority. The public residents will be charged with manslaughter by constitutional supreme authority as co-conspirators to the murder of a constitutional God sovereign asset that ensures the God sovereignty of this earth and cosmic balance as the namesake of Judah.